And I'm actually going
Yeah.
perfect. I'm going to talk a bit about my background. So you don't
Oh,
need me
great.
to
So I
introduce
don't
me.
need to introduce you. Great. I did put a little blurb of yours on Avenue for them to kind of familiarize themselves with. But yeah, so welcome everybody. This is the official last lecture of the semester, and we're so lucky to have Victoria Arrandale here with us. She is a professor at the Dalla School of Public Health at U of T, and she's a huge mentor of mine, someone that I definitely look up to over the last several years that I've had the pleasure of working with Victoria. So Victoria, take it away and welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy. Welcome, everyone. I'm sure for many of you, you know that here in Toronto, our schools got shut down yesterday. So it's a bit chaotic in my house today. So if we're interrupted, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm also probably going to turn my camera off once I get going here, just to save myself some bandwidth, and then I'll turn it back on when we get to the questions at the end. And the other thing I have asked Kathy to do is to save the chat. So if you do have questions, write them in the chat, and I'm hoping to have time at the end to go through some of the questions. But if we don't get to them all, I can answer them in writing. And I think that's the best way, because then everyone can see the answers. I am going to give you my email so you can email me too. But if we can answer in writing, then at least they can be shared with the group. Okay. Okay, so let me turn my camera off to help us get through this and help you hear me. So I'm going to give you a bit of a sample today of occupational exposure and disease research, just a couple of projects that I've been involved with, and hopefully reinforce some of the information you've gotten in this course around the importance of work for health and the potential impacts of work on health. So I will start with a bit about me, because I do find that often people, have questions about this. And this is knowing a bit about how I got where I am today sometimes is interesting and helpful for people. And then I'm going to give you sort of two examples of occupational health, occupational exposure research that I have led. And I'll give you a bit of a list at the end of other things that I do as well, so you can get a flavor for sort of how broad these things can be. Um, People always ask, well, how did you end up here? And it's a really good question. I've done a lot of different jobs over the years, some things that I think a lot of us do when we're younger, in restaurants and babysitting. I was a biology major in my undergrad, and had a couple of really interesting summer jobs. One was a position called vector control that I got quite excited about, because I thought I was going to be dealing with diseases and the animals that spread them. And it ended up just being pest control and dealing with rat infestation. So it was not quite what I thought it was going to be. But it was really this job here that led me to where I am today. And this is a picture of a paper mill in British Columbia, where I grew up. And it was one of my summer jobs as an undergrad student. It was a very well-paying summer job as a member of the union. I was a laborer, but I got hurt at work. And I had always had an interest in health, not really any interest in doing clinical work. So I wasn't interested in nursing or medicine, but I was interested in health. And getting hurt and going through that process really opened my eyes to sort of thinking about the impacts that workplace injuries and illness can have on people, and how serious they can be and how long lasting they can be. And so that really set me on a path. And I did a master's degree at the University of British Columbia. And then I came to Toronto and I did a PhD here. I did spend some time overseas in the Netherlands. I did a postdoctoral fellowship out in Edmonton in Alberta. And then I came back to Toronto, where I worked at the Occupational Cancer Research Center, which is where Kathy and I met. And in 2019, I moved to the University of Toronto, where I am currently in the School of Public Health. So I've done a bit of jumping around, but it's actually quite a small world in occupational environmental health. So even though it looks like I've gone a lot of places, it's sort of in a very small community. So when we're doing occupational exposure and disease research, we're really interested in the relationship between exposure and health. And you may have heard about this in other courses as being a dose response relationship. We tend to think more about the exposure response and thinking about what's happening outside the body rather than the internal dose. But we're interested in lots of different kinds of exposures, chemical exposures, biological, physical exposures. This can be things like noise or vibration or radiation. And then the psychosocial aspect is becoming more and more important. And really my work and my research focuses on the left-hand side of this relationship. I am involved in studies that link the two, but the work that I lead tends to lean more to the left in looking at identifying exposures of workers, measuring them, and determining, what we can do to improve the situation. And the ultimate goal of my research really is to get every worker home safe and healthy. And I think that's one of these challenges that we run up against in occupational health, is that people are often very aware of the injuries and the short-term effects of work, but they're not always thinking so much about the long-term impacts of work. And many occupational diseases don't arise until later in life, and people may actually no longer be working when they get diseases as a result of exposures they had earlier on. And so it can be challenging to study these exposures in these diseases, but it can also be very challenging for workers to identify the connection, or for the medical community to identify the connection when these cases arise. So lots of really challenging aspects, but I really do think very important to be considering these and thinking about how we can prevent these cases of disease. The first of the two projects I wanted to talk to you about today is related to COVID, which is really sort of the center of our lives at the moment. I think it's really impacting how we live, how we work, and how we sort of play or don't play, as the case may be. But COVID-19 is also a really big challenge for workers and for employers. Many workplaces that have never dealt with health hazards are having to focus on the prevention of transmission in their workplace, but also thinking about ways they can reduce the likelihood of COVID-19 coming into their workplace. So there are really two levels that they need to be focusing on at the same time. And I think is becoming more front and center, especially in the third wave, is the importance of occupational health in the context of public health. So with many other workplace hazards, we don't think of them outside of the workplace. The exposure stops when someone leaves work. Someone doesn't bring the exposure to work with them. And that's very different for COVID. The exposure, the worker carries the exposure. And if they acquire COVID-19 at work, they can then take it out into the community. And so workplaces are now, in some cases, very important sites of community transmission, and they play a very big role in preventing the larger pandemic. It's not just about the health and safety of the workers on site. They now have a very big role within public health writ large. And that's new. That's a very new thing for most workplaces. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of chatter about, well, who's going to be at risk of COVID-19 in workplaces? And you can imagine that there are some simple ways to think about who that might have been. And this is a tool that I found on the UK Office for National Statistics based on US Department of Labor data. And it's from ONET, which sometimes is how it's presented, but it uses this really, quite straightforward two factors: how close people work to other people and how often they're exposed to disease, very generally disease, not COVID-19 specifically, but just disease. And you can see that when you do this, so people who are working very close to others with daily exposure to disease, you get all your healthcare workers up in this top right-hand quadrant. And in fact, that's what we would have predicted. But this is only two factors. And what has happened, oh, that didn't do what I thought it was going to do there. Over the course of the last year, Public Health Ontario, here in Ontario, has built upon this particular model. And they have added a lot of contextual information on sort of the ability for workers to work from home, precarity, so how secure employment is. And they now have this live, and I apologize for the link, but there isn't actually a good way to Google this. Usually I would just give you some Google instructions, but it's not popping up on my search strategy. It's called the Occupational Risk of COVID tool. So I will send this link and the slides too, I guess, to Kathy after, and then you can access this if you're interested in exploring it. And certainly, the impact of COVID-19 on workers takes a little bit of time to trickle down. And we're starting to see more research results coming out that really confirm those hypotheses about which workers are at risk and which workers are perhaps not at risk. And this is results from the UK, from their Biobank study, which is a really large population-based study. And they looked at the risk of severe COVID among essential workers versus non-essential workers. And again, so here we see very, very high risk. So 7 and 8 times the risk among healthcare workers compared to non-essential workers, and non-essential workers being people like myself who are able and privileged enough to be able to work at home. And as you move to other groups of essential workers, the risk comes down, but it still seems to be elevated, although it's not statistically significant. I thought I would note here for people that this is actually a bit of a challenge to do in Canada because we don't have information on occupation for our COVID cases. We have some information, but it's not systematically collected or coded. So we're not able to do this for our cases. And we don't have information on where people work in our health data. So that's a challenge that Kathy and I are both very familiar with. It can be linked in some novel ways, but it's not particularly easy in the Canadian context. And I'm not going to read this slide. We're all familiar with the public health prevention measures, these very high level, simple messages for the public to follow. But the challenge for workplaces is that they have to figure out how to do this while keeping their business running and protecting workers. And so I think there are, they seem very simple, but the implementation can be quite complicated for individual workers. And that led to some work last summer that was what's the right word? It was asked for by the Canadian Standards Association group, which is a national organization that develops standards in Canada. And it was supported by My Tax Accelerate, which is a funding organization sort of focused on partnerships and capacity building within this Accelerate program. So myself and 6 graduate students did a rapid research review in order to summarize occupational health and safety prevention practices that could support the reopening and ongoing operation of workplaces during the pandemic. I'll just note that we really did focus on the workplace. So we didn't consider the policy level here. It had to be things that could be implemented in individual workplaces. And it was a very fast process over the summer and 3 rapid stages of expert review with folks across the country to try and ascertain basically what are all the things that workplaces have to at least consider if they're going to reopen or if they're going to operate during the pandemic. And what we did, or how we chose to summarize it in the end, was to think in layers. Now often in health and safety or occupational health, we don't think about the building, but we did say that employers and organizations need to think about the building, the physical structure in which they operate. And that's because ventilation systems can impact transmission. The water in a building can actually introduce additional hazards. So things like Legionella or even heavy metals over periods of stagnation. Then we said workplaces need to think about the space. They need to think about the design of where the work is happening. And this is really focused on implementing those public health prevention measures. So ensuring physical distancing, providing for proper hygiene, the use of face coverings or medical masks, depending on the context. And the third domain or pillar was around the worker themselves. You can see we're coming down in narrowness. And the third one around supporting workers in ensuring their physical and psychological health. And these are things that some organizations do better than others, but certainly during the pandemic has become much more important. And the cross-cutting themes that came up again and again in our review and in our consultation were occupational health and safety culture and communication. So ensuring that workers and employers had open dialogue, ongoing dialogue, particularly because, as we know, our knowledge has changed so quickly with COVID and continues to change quickly, that there does need to be constant sort of updating and training going on there. So the other piece that I always like to highlight when I talk about this report is that COVID exists, but it's layered on top of other hazards. And just because we're very focused on COVID right now doesn't mean we can forget about the other hazards that workers may face at work, especially our essential workers. And so we do have to remember that workplaces are not absolved of any responsibility during the pandemic for other hazards that may be present. So we need to ensure that anything introduced to protect workers from COVID doesn't put them at higher risk of other hazards that they may face in the workplace. I'm going to shift quickly here. So the second study that I thought I would tell you about is a study we've done in electronic waste recycling. And, we're all working on electronics right now as we work remotely. We're on our phones or laptops or desktops or tablets. But globally, we are producing an astronomical amount of electronic waste every year. So this is a really old figure now, but surprisingly, there aren't, it's not updated regularly, but producing 40 million tons of e-waste per year, which is 10% of the human biomass every year. So over 10 years, we're producing as much mass of e-waste as there are human beings on the planet. And that's kind of an astounding statistic. And I'm sure that it's only increasing with, obsolescence and consumer behavior and things like that. But that electronic waste has to go somewhere. We have to do something with it when it reaches its end of life. And there are many exposures that can occur in that processing. So there's a lot of different chemicals, there's ergonomic hazards, and there's physical hazards. We don't know a lot about electronic waste workers, but there's certainly plausible links between the chemicals that they're exposed to and things like allergic disease or skin disease. And there's plausible links with more chronic or longer latency diseases like cancer or reproductive effects. So we did a study that focused just on the flame retardants. And these flame retardants are a good thing. They're put there to keep us safe. They're put there so that electronics don't ignite, but they also have been linked with health effects, most notably with endocrine disruption. So the disruption of hormones, one of the stronger links is around thyroid hormones for many of the flame retardant chemicals. And certainly, as people in a high income country, we have historically shipped our electronic waste overseas to low and middle income countries. And that's incredibly problematic. Those countries often don't have the regulatory framework to protect the people doing the work. And so there has been international agreements over the last 10 or 20 years that are designed to stem that movement so that we're not downloading problems that we create onto parts of the world and workers where they're not protected. But what that means actually is that we are doing more processing and recycling here in Canada. And that's something that not everyone's aware of. But even in downtown Toronto, we have facilities that process and recycle electronic waste. So we did a study. Here's a picture of our study team with funding from the Ministry of Labor to look at exposure to flame retardants in a Canadian facility. It was just one facility. And these are some images you can see. It's quite a basic setup. This is a shredding machine that you can see just exhausts into the workspace. So there's no, there was no enclosed ventilation system in this facility. There were fans and there were doors that could open. But it was quite basic as compared to some of the other operations. This is another old stat, but about 12% of the e-waste is estimated to be captured in Canada. So that means the rest is going into the general waste stream, which is not ideal. So we certainly have work to do here. And these are pictures of the equipment we use when we go into places like electronic waste facilities. But we have 2 samplers here that we put out, and we're sampling the air in this case. This is a piece of silicone rubber that acts as a passive sampler. So that means there's no electricity. It just sits there and it adsorbs and absorbs chemicals and particles that are in the environment. This device here is an active sampler. So we have a pump that's behind this wood wall, and it's connected by tubing to the sampling device. So it's sucking air into the end of the tube. It's collecting the dust and the gases inside. It's an OSHA versatile sampler, but it collects the gases and the dust in here, and then the air just pulls through and exhausts out the side of the pump. So 2 different samplers. We weren't able to put these samplers on the workers in this case, so they're just attached to their workstation. And what we found was that, somewhat surprisingly actually, the levels of flame retardants in this facility were much higher in the dust than they were in other facilities around the world. This is just showing one flame retardant, BDE 209. It's also referred to as DECA. But many times higher than the bulk dust. And if we look at the same flame retardant in air, we saw that compared to other studies that used those fixed samplers, so samplers that were still stationary, they weren't moving around with the workers. Again, we saw much higher levels in this Canadian facility than had been seen in other parts of the world, with one exception, which was a Finnish study where they had done personal samplers. And this means that the sampler was attached to the worker and it moved with the worker. And we often see this disparity in the sampler types, that the workers, they move around, they get closer to the sources of exposure. These personal samples are much more reflective of their own exposure, and they can be much higher. So it's an interesting thing to think about when we're looking at previous research, to ask a question of, well, how did they sample and where was the sampler placed? But we don't have any personal samples for comparison here, so it's a little bit unfortunate. There's a long story there that I won't go into unless people ask. But these stationary samples, we definitely saw much higher levels than we were expecting to see. We really didn't think that, that we would see such high levels in a Canadian facility. So we did observe higher levels than previous studies, many of which were in low and middle income countries where we had been shipping our e-waste over the years. There's many explanations for this. It could be related to the type of waste that's being processed or the volume. So even though this was a simple setup, it was quite efficient, and they were processing large volumes of waste. But this is the piece that I haven't touched on, but many of the flame retardants have been banned and replaced by new flame retardants. But we found both types of flame retardants in this facility, and that's a really important finding for the workers. If we go to the store and buy electronics today, we cannot buy products with banned flame retardants in them, but we still have those products in our basements, and we still send those products for processing. And so the workers doing this work have exposure to chemicals that we know to be quite hazardous. And there's a lot of other exposures. We focused on flame retardants, but there are many metals in this environment. It's a very dusty environment. We probably didn't measure the most hazardous exposures in this study. And certainly this whole industry is not particularly well connected to our occupational health and safety system. So we need to build more bridges here. And we also, at a higher level, we need to really think about what we're going to do in terms of electronic waste more broadly, and how we're going to manage this huge burden that we're creating. And there is a push towards really considering the full life cycle of products. And putting some onus on manufacturers and point of sale organizations to take some responsibility for what they sell. And so I'm hopeful, but I'm not sure we're moving fast enough here. I will just say here, I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples at the end. We've also done some work in nail salons with you can see similar sampling devices as we used in the e-waste facility, looking at things like formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen, but also methyl methacrylate, which is a very potent sensitizer or allergen. And we do lots of other research. We look at diesel engine exhaust, both from an environmental perspective and from an occupational perspective. I mentioned the data linkage studies up front, but we use this exposure information and we link large cohorts of workers with health data to see if they're at increased risk of those diseases relative to other workers or to other members of the population. And I'm doing more work now, more laboratory-based work, looking at novel methods for measuring exposure. So I showed you a couple of those pictures, and you can see that this isn't overly burdensome. This nail salon technician has a pump on her back, but it's not something workers really enjoy doing. They find that it interrupts their work processes. Sometimes it's quite loud. And so there's a whole concept of exposomics that was first posited by a man named Christopher Wilde almost 20 years ago now. But this idea of thinking about exposures more holistically. And the benefit of this, I think, is that it does allow us to think more about mixtures of exposures or exposure profiles, whereas everything I showed you today and the majority of exposure work looks at single chemicals, one chemical at a time and its relation to disease. But we know that's not how exposure happens in the real world, that people have quite complex mixtures of exposures. And it's not something that we've really ever properly addressed. And and this is one avenue, I think, where we might begin to get a better handle on the impact of the mixture rather than the individual chemicals. So this is an area that's certainly rapidly expanding, including the use of those passive samplers that you saw pictures of, but also biological samples using things like urine, which is easy to collect to look at exposure in workers. So I will stop there. I don't have any wrapping up thoughts because it's a bit of a shotgun approach to telling you about different things that are going on, but that is my email there. And I will take a peek at the chat as well and see if there are any questions. Maybe Kathy can get us started off.
Yeah, so feel free if anybody has any questions. I'll start us off. Victoria, what's been your favorite project to work on?
Oh, that's
in
a
terms
good
of
question.
Any sort of exposure projects or other projects?
I've really enjoyed the nail salon work, and I've enjoyed it because it started as a community-based project. So there's a healthy nail salon network here in Toronto that is really working to increase awareness and knowledge among salon owners and salon workers and connect the workers into resources that they may need. It's a hugely complicated industry for the workers and the owners, and often the owners are workers. So it doesn't have the defined roles that we see in other industries. So I've learned a ton from working with the community members on that, and allowing them to sort of direct where we went with the research was a really new experience. And that work continues. And so that's probably my favorite so far. Yeah.
Simnima, do you have a question? I see that your hand was raised.
Yes, I do. Do you think, sorry, I'm just trying to find myself. Yeah. Do you think that over time, the health place regulations and safety has gotten better or worse over the years based on your research and the work you've done?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think at a very high level, it has improved over time. So if we think of the last 100 years, we've made some very significant advances in improving health and safety in workplaces. But there's still a long way to go. And I think there workplaces change and evolve, and there are new types of work, and there are new exposures, there are new hazards that arise. And I don't think we're very good at recognizing and addressing these new problems that come up. We know what to do with the old stuff that we've always been dealing with, and it's still there, which I think is frustrating for many of us, thinking about things like asbestos, which you'll probably have heard a bit about. We're still dealing with these historical problems. Meanwhile, we've got a lot of gig workers, and are they employees or are they not? They still have a lot of hazardous exposures when they're working. And nail salons is another example. Electronic waste is another. So there's the nature of work is changing, and I'm not sure that our health and safety system is responsive enough. And I think that we need to do better on being more nimble and able to adapt to the changing nature of workplaces.
Thank you. I also have one more question for you.
Sure.
When you say, when we talked earlier, you shared that in some occupations, some people are more vulnerable to being exposed. Do you also think that some ethnic groups or some people with certain backgrounds are also more likely to be exposed with hazards than others? Or is it solely based on the type of occupation?
Right. So that's a really complicated question. So I think that if we think just about exposure, so who's exposed, there are differences, but many of those differences in exposure stem from the structural inequities in our economy. So it's, we do have more BIPOC workers in precarious work, for example, or in workplaces where they're perhaps more likely to have exposures or higher levels of exposure. But that has nothing to do with them as individuals. That has to do with sort of the system of how the economy and the structures work. So I think in occupational health, we tend not to focus on the individual, and I can see the criticism there, but what we like to focus on is the modifiable risk factors. So how can we make the workplace safe for everybody, and really pushing regulators and employers to reduce exposure and make the workplace safe regardless of who the worker is that walks into the workplace at the beginning of the day. But certainly, all of these inequities in our society are reflected in workplaces. The workplaces are not immune to that. Yeah.
Thanks, Amina.
Thank
Victoria,
you.
I do see that
I'm gonna have to. I know I have to go. I'm so sorry. I've left my email on the screen. I will share the slides with Kathy. And if there are other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be really happy to respond and to answer any questions that come up, Kathy. And I'm very sorry for the tight turnaround this morning.
No problem.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Victoria. We really appreciate your time.
Have a good day.
Thanks. So for the rest of today's lecture, I am going to share my screen and share some more slides about the final exam that I'm sure everybody is keen to know about. So just to reiterate, when is this exam happening? It's in exactly 3 weeks now. So April 28th, a Wednesday, and it's going to be at 4 p.m. That's when it's scheduled. It's scheduled until 6:30, so 2.5 hours. For anyone that maybe wasn't here in last week's lecture, so I did mention that it's going to be a Google Docs exam, which means that there's just going to be an announcement that goes on Avenue with a link. You're going to have to click that link. It'll take you to that Google Docs exam. You'll download the Word doc. You'll have to type in your responses in the Word doc, and then you're going to have to submit the Word doc back onto Avenue as you would any other assignment that you've been doing in this course. So think of it as kind of a take-home assignment that you'll be filling out and then re-uploading onto Avenue. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Now, what's on the exam? Again, I did ask you guys last week if you had any feedback, you can fill out that survey. So I am going to keep the survey up until the end of the weekend, probably. So maybe Sunday night or so. I did notice, I think, about 15 responses so far. So not a whole lot, still plenty of opportunities to kind of have your say and let me know, again, your preferences on things like question types or particular topics that you would like to see on the exam. Just a reminder that it is worth 30% of your mark. I have made some decisions based on what people have said so far in the survey. So there, surprisingly, was an overwhelming preference, I guess I should say, for multiple choice questions, which, yeah, I'm glad I asked. I wouldn't have thought that. My own personal experience, I've always had a little bit of anxiety around multiple choice questions. So I tend to prefer the more kind of long answer, short answer questions. But due to popular demand, you guys seem to prefer the multiple choice. So we're going to have 20 of those questions. In terms of the other types of questions, again, most of you actually opted for the matching option instead of things like, what did I ask? True and false, fill in the blanks, that kind of stuff. So we're going to do matching. The other questions, there are going to be some short answer questions. And so again, lots of you put into the feedback that you would prefer some options. So of course, we can definitely give you guys some options, and then you'll get to choose out of 5 potential short answer questions, you'll get to choose 3 that you'll want to answer. And then there is going to be 1 long answer question. I know some of you expressed a deep non-preference, I guess I should say, for long answer questions, but these are important for you to show me and the TA who's going to be helping me mark these, that you do know the information that you're going to be studying for this course. And personally, I think that they are a good opportunity for you guys to get kind of these bonus marks. You just get to say everything you think you know that's related to that question. So often it's actually an opportunity for you to do better in case you maybe don't do as well on sections like the multiple choice or the matching. So unfortunately, you can't escape the long answer completely, but there will only be 1 of those questions that you'll have to answer out of a possible 3. Now, in terms of the length, this exam can be written in about an hour and a half. It's not overly long. If you study, certainly you can probably kind of fly through it pretty quickly, but you will get almost double that time. So remember, it starts at 4, you have until 6:30, but I'm going to give you a little bit of buffer room there. So if you need, that extra 30 minutes in case you run into any issues with technology, in case, your submission on Avenue isn't working right away, I'm going to keep that open until 7 p.m. No problem. So you'll have 3 hours from 4 to 7 technically. But any submissions that go and get uploaded after 7 p.m. are not going to be graded. Now, I put a little asterisk here because I do know that some of you do have accommodations through SAS. So if you are a student who usually has a little bit of extra time for something like an exam, maybe just send me an email to remind me to kind of look out for that. And then we can figure out how much extra time that you'll be needing, something like that. I do see someone has a question. How long should the short answer be, and how long the long answer questions? That's a good question. If I should give you guys a word limit, would you guys find it helpful to have a word limit? They are, I can tell you how much they're worth, right? And that tends to kind of show you how much you should be writing. So for something like a short answer question, which is about 8 marks each, right? So 3 times 8, 24. You would probably expect maybe half a page or so of a response, again, depending, I guess, on the question, depending on how many details you want to provide. Something like a long answer question would maybe be closer to 3/4 of a page or a page, again, depending on how much detail you want to provide. It kind of does depend. I'm seeing some responses here. So yes, word limits would be helpful, word limit or page limit. Yeah, so I can definitely put that in, but if I had to say it off the top of my head, yeah, I wouldn't expect for a short answer question to be more than about half a page, single spaced, I guess also depending on your font size. But yeah, I can definitely put that in. And then again, that long answer, I would probably expect to be closer to maybe a page, but It does depend. Maybe some of you are really efficient writers and you can say everything you need to say that would be worth those 12 marks in half a page. I don't know. It's a little bit hard for me to gauge, right? But definitely, timing is a little bit of a constraint. So you don't want to spend an hour and a half of your time just writing a long answer question. That might not be that helpful. So kind of be aware of that. So I do want to do a little bit of a wrap up to give you a sense of, well, what should you study? What should you maybe study a bit less? So hopefully by the end of this course, we know that we've spent quite a lot of time talking about all these different factors, these determinants of health and how they impact or how they shape global and local patterns of both mortality as well as morbidity. So both death rates as well as disease rates. Hopefully, walking away from this course, you get a real sense that the location and the place, these are really important factors that influence how many of these types of health determinants actually shape those health outcomes. So whether that's death or disease in many different ways. So we've spent a whole lot of time talking about all these sort of different layers, different aspects of the socio-ecological model. So hopefully a model like this is, pretty familiar to you by this point, and hopefully in studying for the exam, you'll kind of get a sense of what are the important kind of determinants of health, what are ones that we maybe spent a lot of time talking about, what are ones that maybe we didn't discuss in as much detail that will probably kind of help shape or guide your studying. So what's actually going to be on the exam? Well, there are going to be some questions related to these, but not a whole lot of questions. So I'm going to help you guys out in terms of prioritizing what topics you should study the most. So things like study designs, where we talked about different studies like cohorts versus case controls, different measures of death and disease like incidence rates or case fatalities, mortality rates, that kind of thing. How we used maps to study disease patterns, when we talked about population dynamics, so when we talked about those little pyramids, also therapeutic environments, which was the focus of your second assignment, and then things like healthcare systems and this week's topic on workplace and health. So these themes, these topics, I'm going to go out and tell you that you may not see them as much reflected in some of those questions like short answer or long answer. However, they are still likely to show up in questions like multiple choice or the matching part of the exam. So do what you will with that kind of information. Maybe these are topics you are already pretty familiar with, and so you maybe won't feel like you need to spend as much time studying. Again, that's not necessarily for me to decide, but I can tell you that these are the topics that are maybe not going to appear as much in some of those short answer, long answer questions. On the other hand, if I would offer some advice, it would be to maybe spend a little bit more time refreshing your memory and studying these topics. So these are the topics that you might have to explain in a little bit more detail. So something like disease ecology or landscape epi, which interestingly enough was a bit of a controversial topic from this survey. So some of you seem to really like that topic. Some of you found it a little bit confusing. And so by any means, if any of these topics have been confusing and you feel like you would benefit from any sort of clarification, do get in touch with me or your TA, whoever you feel comfortable with, and we can do our best to explain anything that maybe wasn't unclear when we first talked about these. If you have any remaining questions about them, do get in touch. So some of the other topics that might be a little bit more fruitful for you to study would be things like the epidemiologic transition. We spent a lot of time talking about infectious disease transmission, socioeconomic health factors, which I think most of you said you enjoyed and was a topic that you liked. So hopefully you'll see that reflected in the exam. Something like health psychology, again, we spent quite a bit of time talking about, and then access to healthcare. So we spent about a week and a half talking about that in terms of access to healthcare from rural versus remote versus more urban settings, and then talking as well about aging and how that factors into access. So these topics are, again, going to be more likely to show up in some of those questions where you might have to provide more of those details, something like a short answer or long answer. So maybe you'll want to spend a little bit more time kind of revisiting these topics if they weren't topics that you weren't necessarily all that familiar with. Now, what's not going to be on the exam? I can tell you right off the bat that you're not going to be doing another critical appraisal using the Bradford Hill criteria. You already did that for the first assignment, so there's no point having you guys do that again. That being said, it would be helpful for you to know why some of the criteria are used. Why is something like temporality important in a health study, for example? Why would you need to know whether something makes biological sense, for example? So some aspects of it are still going to be useful because, of course, they tell us a lot about why we should be looking at health studies in the first place. But you won't be asked any particular details. You won't be required to go through the criteria and provide that critical appraisal again. That being said, you also will not be asked to discuss therapeutic landscapes in a whole lot of detail again. I know that this is a really popular topic and I'm glad you guys really enjoyed it, but given that you have already done that for the second assignment, there's not really a point to see whether you know it well. I know that you guys know your therapeutic landscapes well. But again, if you see that it would be helpful, maybe knowing why we use topics around therapeutic landscapes to describe how people interact with environments, how they influence health, that certainly is sort of fair game for you to be tested on. And again, that might appear in other questions, but you won't be asked to explain those in a whole lot of detail. You also will not be asked to draw any figures or diagrams. I know that we've occasionally shown different figures or diagrams for how things work. Certainly something like a population pyramid or things like that. We've shown a lot of these different types, but you won't be asked to draw anything. You may be asked to interpret some of those types of figures or diagrams that we've spent a lot of time discussing in the course. So just to be aware of that, you may want to revisit some of them if maybe, again, they weren't all that clear the first time you saw them. So I think that's pretty much all I've got. If there are any questions, again, let me know. And I want to say thanks so much, everybody, for a really fun semester. Good luck with everything. Hopefully you enjoyed the course. Hopefully you don't find studying for the exam too difficult. And by any means, if you have questions, do get in touch because I'm happy to answer those. So that is all that we have for today.
Thank you.
No problem.